Alright. Alright, we're going to section 4. Alright, so America's a world power. Alright, so Roosevelt became president in 1901. We talked about Roosevelt a lot. Well, all these presidents we're talking about, we've talked about once before in our progressive unit. But now we're going to talk about their foreign policy measures. Alright? He became president in 1901 after McKinley was assassinated by Leon Czolgosz. And Roosevelt is going to try to stop imperial powers from controlling the world's political and economic destiny. And so he builds on the idea of the open door notes and begins increasing American influence in East Asia by mediating a settlement between Russia and Japan. All right. And so we have the Russo-Japanese War, which was Russia and Japan were imperialist powers competing for control of Korea. Japan won a series of battles. They began running low on men and money, and Japan asked Theodore Roosevelt to mediate negotiations. Okay. Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for his successful efforts in negotiating the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the war between the two nations. And the U.S. and Japanese interest expanded in East Asia. Alright. A lot of people felt like we needed a canal that could cut across and send ships across, so people wouldn't have to go all the way down to the bottom part of South America just to get to it. Get to the other half of America. This cuts down the time by months. So it creates a good shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific to reduce the travel time. Colombia is ruled by Panama, but negotiations had failed, and so they convinced the Panamans, let's just say convinced Panama to rebel and organize against Colombia. And in 1903, the United States sent warships as a present as Panama declared independence. And the United States will end up paying $10 million plus $250,000 a year to help pay for the Panama Canal. All right, constructing the canal. All right, construction ranks as one of the world's greatest engineering feats. But there was a huge problem. Disease, yellow fever, and malaria helped prevent it from going faster, and it created dangerous working conditions because of the heat, the mosquitoes, the dangerous machinery. It was just bad. It cost a total of $380 million. It opened in 1914, but it damaged the U.S. Latin American relations in South America due to the American support of the rebellion in Panama. And Congress ended up paying Colombia $25 million as compensation of lost territory. All right, Roosevelt corollary. Financial factors drew the United States further into Latin American affairs. Many Latin American countries borrowed money from European banks, railroads, development industries. Roosevelt doesn't want them to get involved if they could not pay. So he reminded them of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine that demanded that European countries stay out of the affairs of Latin American nations. Well, he creates the Roosevelt corollary, where he extends the Monroe Doctrine and where he claims the right to protect its economic interests by means of military intervention. Alright? And so things like his slogan was "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Dollar diplomacy. This exercised police power several times in the 1910s. William Taft followed policy of guaranteeing loans made to other countries by American businesspeople, and thus gains dollar diplomacy, where the U.S. power of using the nation's economic power to exert influence over other countries. And this was used to justify keeping Europe out of the Caribbean. Okay. Alright, Woodrow Wilson's missionary diplomacy. This gave the Monroe Doctrine a moral tone, where he said that the United States had a moral responsibility to deny recognition to any Latin American government it viewed as oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to the United States. And it pressured the Western Hemisphere to establish democracies. Alright, And this is going to kind of come to head with the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution, we have Porfirio Diaz, who was a military dictator. He ruled Mexico for about 30 years. He was a good friend of the United States. But in 1911, Mexican peasants and workers led by Francisco Madero overthrew Diaz. Madero promised reforms, but he was unable to fix the gap, and conflicts between the classes rose in Mexico. 2 years later, we have a military general, Victoriano Huerta, takes over the government, and he murders Madero. And when President Wilson finds out what happened, he says he refused to recognize a government of butchers. Well, in 1914, a small group of American sailors were arrested, and they were quickly released, and Mexico apologized, but Wilson used the opportunity to intervene in Mexico. He ordered the United States Marines to occupy Veracruz, an important Mexican port. 18 Americans and 200 Mexicans died during the invasion. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile stepped in to mediate the conflict. They proposed that Huerta steps down, and the United States will withdraw without paying for damages. Mexico rejects the plan. The United States refuses to recognize Huerta, and the Huerta regime eventually falls apart. Well, in 1915, Venustiano Carranza becomes president in 1950. The United States will recognize his government and withdraw their troops. But we have some that don't like Carranza and are rebelling against it. We have Emiliano Zapata, all right, who was a Mexican rebel that was dedicated to land reform, and we have Pancho Villa, who also resented rule of Carranza, worked with Zapata, but Villa began threatening reprisals against the United States. So he took Americans off a mining train and shot them. Okay? Well, Wilson doesn't like that. And so he orders General John J. Pershing, and he has him and 15,000 soldiers into Mexico to capture Villa, dead or alive. Well, Pancho Villa kept running, and Wilson called out 150,000 National Guardsmen and stationed them along the Mexican border. Mexicans began angry over the U.S. invasion of their land. So in 1916, the United States troops clashed with Carranza's army, and Carranza demanded the United States withdrawal, and Wilson refuses. Both sides back down. Wilson orders troops home. Mexico adopts a constitution that gave the government control of the nation's oil and mineral resources. It placed strict regulations on foreign invasions. Carranza ruled oppressively until 1920. Now, there's another reason, part of the reason he had to pull his troops out was because there's a war going on across the ocean, known as the Great War. And it's a world war, but it's fought mainly in Europe. And the U.S. was getting ever so closer into possibility of entering that conflict. Well, Carranza ruled until 1920, and Alvaro Obregón took over, and he came to power after Carranza, and this marked the end of Civil War and the beginning of Mexican reform. Alright, so that's a lot in a short amount of time. So some foreign policy achievements during the early 20th century. They expanded access to overseas markets. They continued to grow the economy. Alright, they built a modern navy to protect interests, and they exercised international police power to dominate Latin America. Alright, this is in the early 20th century. Alright,